Okay, multifamily. Chris Benedict is an architect in New York, and she's been really leading the charge. So I decided to start with some of her work. This is her first multifamily project, a 24-unit affordable housing building with 15 accessible units in Brooklyn. So watching the construction photos of this was really something. It made me, you think Chicago's kind of tough, but man, the site constraints and staging are like something else. This is her next Brooklyn project, also 24 units. It says unis, 24 unis, but it's units, accessible and affordable. Another Brooklyn project, and this is basically EFIS over CMU. So what's really cool about what she did here with the design is she had the EPS, the exterior rigid foam, cut in these shapes, kind of making this sort of water shedding shape and shading for the windows, and basically had them erected that way. There was an interesting story that the planning commission, I guess, gets to say, if they don't like it, they can give you a critique and say you got to change your design or what have you. And so she actually wound up taking the shapes that they had already ordered and kind of rotating them, because I guess it was all kind of going the same kind of fish scaling down the building, and then so she rotated it to get this offset, and it just makes this fantastic shadow play. So they just stuccoed over that. And yeah, and she said when the stucco guys pulled the scaffold away, they all just kind of went, "Wow, what have we done?" The interesting things to notice about this, what about this says passive house? Well, you can see that there's a fair amount of insulation in a sense, but these little dots here are ventilation points, and so she's compartmentalized these units very. It's one of the things that is good for air tightness in general, and also if you want to have an area of the building that is not conditioned or airtight, like where the elevator is, you need to break the units from that. But breaking the units from each other is good as well. It keeps stack effect from happening in the building. It keeps smells out of other people's units. If there's a slightly different set point, it's not a problem. So. So anyway, but the ventilation you can basically see on the face of the building. This is a rendering of a building that she started in northern part of Manhattan. I'm sorry I don't have any better pictures of this. It's just a fascinating thing. The code requirements for where operable windows can be relative to ventilation points kind of drove the facade design. So you get this not only passive house, thermal bridge free, but you get this other overlay of, ventilation and stale air and fresh air kind of driving the facade design. So it kind of made this incredible collage. Moving west to Pittsburgh, this is a project by 4080 Architecture and Kaplan Thompson Architects in Maine. We're the passive house consultant. I saw Jesse Thompson present this at the conference, and the developer of this is Action Housing, and they're a very interesting developer in Pittsburgh. At the Passive House Conference 2 years ago in Pittsburgh, Larry Swanson, who's the director of Action Housing, got up and said, it doesn't make sense for us not to do passive house because we have to hold the building for 15 years after we build it. And when we asked our architect to look at the math and figure out what the effect would be of passive house savings versus built to code, we were about $1.5 million ahead on this one particular building, so it was crazy not to. And so he's actually been pushing for it. I should say Action Housing has been pushing for it. And that project that he was talking about was a YMCA that they were retrofitting. Masonry building, interior retrofit. And I'm sorry that I don't have any pictures of it, but it's a project you can look up. Thoughtful Balance is the name of the firm that did the design. They did a single family for, maybe it was a two flat, I'm not sure, for Action Housing. And then they did the YMCA. And then a different firm here, 4080 is doing this Uptown Loft. So this is 23 affordable units plus 24 units for young adults coming out of foster care. And Jesse's, showing all these kind of details, how they're getting their thermal bridge free. I think these are maybe Cascadia clips for cladding. You can see window bucks here where thermal insulation. Exterior rigid is going to go on over this, air barrier, airtight plane that's put up, probably a fluid applied weatherproof membrane, air tightness barrier as well. And then as an architect doing this stuff, you look at these sort of things where you can imagine steel going up into the building and thinking, oh my God, there's just going to be thermal bridging to no end. They had these kind of washers that you usually use, I think, for mounting mechanical equipment, resilient washers to use as thermal breaks. So anyway, all this stuff gets modeled. It's impressive. Onion Flats in Philadelphia. These guys are amazing. Tim McDonald and a couple of his brothers started a company a while ago. They did design build, and then they bought a modular factory, and they make their own modules. They're also passive house consultants. They're just like one big thing, and they're doing more and more developments, multifamily. We're seeing some townhouse units here, the Belfield townhomes that were completed a couple years ago as passive houses. This Ridge Flats, 126 units in Philadelphia. Last week, Tim told me that they're working on, getting the contract in line. So this hopefully will be underway here soon. It's a really impressive project. All their projects are, and it's just amazing the amount of work they're doing. I want to go to Philadelphia and take a little tour. This project is in Eugene, Oregon. It's called Stellar Apartments, and it was an interesting project because, as you can see from the site plan, there were a number of different units. Number one up there is the passive house building, and then number two here was built to the Earth Advantage standard, which is kind of like LEED. It's a point-based system, and it gives you points for energy, but doesn't require anywhere near the level of thermal rigor that passive house does. And when you look at the relationship in the envelope, you can see here from this window detail, it's basically a couple more inches of rigid insulation outside the same darn, standard wood frame. And this is a very common technique for passive houses. Basically, fill the cavity with insulation. You're going to have thermal bridging at every stud, as you can see here from this thermal image camera. So you put some insulation on it, and actually you can just see a little ghost of it there. It's almost like you want a little more. But that was at 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and orange here is, this is going from 18.5 to 30, so it's not that hot. This is probably 20-something degrees, but you can see it's telegraphing through a little bit. Rim joists are always suspect. So the point, though, it's interesting in this detail. You see with the rigid here, you're not only getting more insulation and continuous insulation, because the siding can be put on via furring strips, which are screwed to the studs, so you don't have to have anything solid where the siding is. You're also seeing a really distinct air tightness transition there to the windows. So these are the things that you just start to plug in and think about as you go to this next level of thermal rigor. So what did they get? Well, the Earth Advantage was pretty good, but passive house is about 36% better in overall energy use. And when you look at the big blue pie changing from 41% down to 17%, that's heating. So that's the story with passive house everywhere. And the reason that happens is because we know that in cold climates, it's usually about 50% of our heating load, or energy load, rather. So that's the first big thing to take a crack at. Interestingly, though, water heating is usually second, and here it turns out to be the case. So here we are at 22% on each of those. So that didn't change. Plug loads are relatively similar. That's people using TVs and blenders and whatever. And I think there's probably an ERV in here. Yeah. So you're wondering how much does it cost to run that ERV all year long? Well, it's 4% of your overall energy use. So you have ECM motors that are efficient, and it's not a huge drain. And then you can see kind of as the temperature moves throughout the day or throughout the year, you're getting your big energy savings, yellow being passive house using less. So nice effective comparison there. Here's a retrofit project. Michael Hindle is the president of the Passive House Alliance Board of Managers, and he's also a passive house consultant working with Matt Fine who's an architect and a passive house consultant, this ZAD Passive in DC. And they have this Delta Commons building, kind of brick building, 50s, I think. And so the idea is, how do we retrofit this? Well, you can do interior, you can do exterior. Interior is often problematic because you have walls coming in and hitting the exterior, so you've got thermal bridging there. And you have space constraints. I mean, the rooms are usually, in this era especially, not oversized, let's say. So an exterior retrofit, in this case, since you're going to have some moisture load building up on the inside, they decided to go with the vapor open enclosure. So they're putting on some spray fiberglass over, with these sort of 9.5-inch eye joists as furring strips. And then a weather-resistant barrier serves as an airtight layer to the outside of that. And then you've got air sealing tape and then fiber cement cladding on top of that. So as is typical with passive house, you're going to have a continuous uninterrupted insulation and airtightness layer. They actually had to interrupt it here, but they found it wasn't too big a ding on the energy, so it was fine. But yeah, like a parapet, that gets a little funky, right? You've got exterior rigid coming up and over. You got to figure out how you're going to frame this, how you're going to attach a coping, attach the roofing and the flashing, and make everything nice and sound. So let's see if I have the slide of the windows. Yeah. So there were a number of challenges that they had to deal with here, like predetermined siting. You can't get these things like ideally facing south or southeast like you'd like to. So they came up with different types of shading details that would work on the different orientations to optimize and shade at the right time, not shade at the wrong time, etc. And that's just fixed, built in. So pretty fascinating retrofit. And again, it's very tuned to the climate and to the site, and that's the beauty of it. Okay, moving out west to Portland. This is a project that's just recently completed, the Kiln Apartments, and it's 19 units in an 18,000 square foot building with retail in the bottom. So great, I mean, biking neighborhood, all that kind of thing. Excuse me. And you've got interiors here. You can see it doesn't look like you're taking a lot of sacrifice in quality of space for this level of performance. You can see the tilt-turn windows here. These are typical European triple glazed, where they can tilt a little bit in like that for ventilation, but they can also turn in for cleaning or more ventilation and what have you. Shot of the lobby and then the building at night. Somebody online has got access to a microphone and they're speaking. Yeah. So there we go. I think they quieted down. Okay, we're going to spend a little more time on this project because it's got a lot of great details here. And how are we doing on time? 6:40, good. Yeah, okay, good. So let's wrap this up in about 10 minutes. Thank you to Dylan Lamar. Greenhammer is a company in Portland that does passive house consulting and I believe design build, do you know? Anyway, they are working as a passive house consultant on this project, which is a big one and is a big team. And that's part of the story of this, is how do you get a team on a big project building a passive house, because nobody's done this before, really. So we got a developer, an owner's rep, architect of record, Ankram Moisen, Greenhammer doing the passive house consulting, Walsh Construction, which is not our Chicago Walsh Construction, it's a different one, the general contractor, mechanical engineer, structural engineer, civil, landscape, and a design architect. So here's the site, and the unit, the building on the left here is the unit that's in construction right now, and the one that we're going to be looking at, and these other two are future phases. So so this is Metro Portland. It's just kind of west of downtown a little ways. I'm not that familiar with the geography out there. I wish I was. Another place I want to go and look at passive houses, among other things, like the Gorge. So here's the building. We can see the shape of it. It's not like this passive solar thing where it's all spread out facing south. Passive house does not equal passive solar. You just need to calculate your energy. and you can see there's shading here, preventing overheating. You know that this is what's happening with this kind of design that's exciting to me, is there's more interaction of building an environment in terms of both orientation and shading, and it's very, very site specific. So these are some of the lessons from the team. I'm just kind of reading off from Dylan and his team. Basically, their big point was that the team needs to be integrated, and everybody has to be there from the very beginning. Even on a single-family house, it's very, very difficult if somebody who's not in the passive house world goes off and does some design and hands you a plan and says, "Here, can you passive house this?" Well, the answer is, maybe, but I wouldn't want to do it. So owner, design team, construction team, everybody has to be fully committed. You're not going to force this down anybody's throat. And they were, because they knew the value of it. The design charrette very early on has to get everybody there kind of buying in, and you got to establish the key concepts like, yes, there is going to be shading, or I don't know. I mean, you know how it is when you start to design a building, that you don't want to sort of throw on a big factor later on that's going to affect energy and budget and all those things. And then in developing the design, there's a lot of iteration. Just like what we saw with those BOPS models, you're doing that with the energy model for this particular building. So you do some design work, you do some modeling work in PHUP or WUFI Passive. You look at what that means for cost. You say, hey, maybe we should swap out this type of insulation for that, or these windows for those. Review its constructability. It's just a big team. And they had some pictures of like the whole team sitting around the table. I didn't include those, but it really gets the point across. Ultimately, this is what they wound up with: roof assembly of R81. And Portland is a milder climate than ours. And they did it with polyiso above trusses. So I assume that is because they wanted to run ducting and electrical and probably no plumbing up above, but in the trusses of the roof. I'm doing a project right now where we're using trusses and we're just filling it with cellulose with a big air gap at the top for ventilation, because we don't want to do the foam if we don't have to. Foam's expensive, but we can't put any lights in there or ducts in there or anything in there because we have an airtight layer. For us is on the bottom of the truss. For them, it's the structural decking at the top, so it makes it nice and easy. So yeah, exterior foam can make things kind of nice and easy. Exterior walls at R39, they're doing it with some mineral fiber board outside of 2x10 framing with blown-in fiberglass. So that's kind of an interesting assembly. Wouldn't work in this climate. You got to be careful because our temperatures at the outside of the 2x10, if that's your air barrier, that's going to get really cold, and 1.5 inches of mineral fiber board insulation is not going to be enough to control condensation. So I will say that becoming a passive house consultant may be a much better aware of building science. So anyway, so we want those bulletproof assemblies for your climate. Typical slab assembly, R19, just basically 4 inches of EPS underneath the slab, and then the plumbing and whatnot running down here. You'll see a lot of passive house architects, or these guys, Geologic out in Maine. They like to put 12 inches of sand and gravel in between slab and insulation to run the plumbing in there. So there's some different ways to skin that cat as well. There's a lot of different ways, actually, and that's why you get into these kind of things. Foundation coordination drawings, where you're like iterating and saying, well, maybe if we take the radon barrier here, and then how do we turn it up the wall? And there's a tremendous amount of this kind of thing. Airtightness is the other thing, along with thermal bridging. I would say, as an architect, you got to figure out, okay, it's easy enough to think about how to make a wall airtight. Transitioning a wall to a foundation is always a little bit of a trick. Sometimes at floors, it's a little bit of a trick. It's always a trick here where you've got something that you want to just cantilever out and you can't. So you're going to have a ledger or an exterior structure. And then transitioning the air barrier at the roof is always a little bit of a trick. I think we've got a detail of that coming up here. And then windows, of course, you got to seal those guys in. Critical details along the assembly. HVAC design in these, there's a lot of different ways people are doing this. What they chose is basically a combined ducting system where they have the HRV with a heat pump. Ventilation is always part of passive house. It's always got to run effectively, and then you can duct it with conditioned air or without. And if you do it without, sometimes the heat pump is just a point source. That's the way we did it in our last passive house in River Forest. We just had 2 mini splits on the wall blowing without any ducting, and then energy recovery ventilator moving the air around. So breaking it up into zones, so you have like mechanical zone doing these units, one doing these units, etc. So in construction, there was a lot of attention during bid to make sure that it's clear and that there's a tight review of the bids. Again, more coordination, the RFIs and the early construction meetings and the mock-ups, just like on any building, but on passive house, even more so, I would say, to make sure that these details really are going to be airtight, because if you got all these things installed and you run your final blower door and it's not airtight, you're not making it. And if everybody's counting on that badge, you better have it. So here's some photos of in construction. You can see some geofoam. You know, this is the stuff they use under highways and bridges and stuff. That's a really, really dense EPS. You can put it underneath a footing, and so you don't have to do a deep footing. You can do a shallow footing if your climate allows with frost. And then once that's all formed up, this is under slab plumbing. I assume this is probably the radon release. And all that stuff, of course, has to be cut into the under slab foam. So again, we're not going to have a cold slab. There's going to be cold nothing in the winter. It's going to be nice and insulated around all sides, and all that insulation is going to touch. So, and then there's our radon barrier and capillary break. Slab goes poured on top of that, and then we've got a beautiful thing to work on, lift our walls off of. Here you can see those big 2x10 walls going up with the sheathing. This sheathing becomes the air barrier then. And then typically this has one of two techniques, either a fluid applied air barrier like Henry or Tremco or Prosoco. Prosoco is Living Building Challenge certified. I should say redless compliant, I guess is the right way. And you put that on the seams, put it on the whole thing if you want it as a air barrier and weather resistant barrier. Or you can just tape the seams with like Sega tape. They make a whole series of tapes for air tightness. I'm not sure what they're using here. So conclusions. What they said was the architects of record would do it again. The owner said maybe. So maybe means to me like, yeah, well, we're only going to get better at this, right? So they found that the cost premium for that project in that climate was about 11%. That's the first cost premium. So you put that against 90% savings on heating and cooling, and usually about 70–75% energy savings overall. And it's usually going to be, as we were seeing from those curves, cash flow positive. Biggest challenges are the same things we hear, of course, lack of passive house certified building components that are made here in the States. They're starting to come, but doors and windows, like, man, commercial doors, try to get an airtight commercial door. Wow. And a thermally broken airtight commercial door, there's a company out in Seattle that'll make one for you, but my client for this Park District project we're doing, I don't think is going to pay for it. HVAC equipment, yes. So they went with some of these more local units, and the hit to the model, the energy model, hurt. It can be done, but if you're trying to optimize and you don't have room to trade off in other places, then that can be challenging. So a motivated, integrated team approach with everybody drinking the Kool-Aid is essential, and then normally design this. So everybody will always be walking along or looking at design and going, well, normally in this kind of project we would, and so finally they just put up a sign, normally does not exist on this project. So, okay, conclusion. We welcome everybody to join in this kind of conversation, not just here, but Passive House in general. It's a really great group of people when you go to the conferences or join us at our meetup groups. It's kind of open source. There's a lot of sharing of information because we're all trying to figure this out together. You go to meetup.com and look at Passive House Alliance Chicago. You can find our local group. You can go to fias.org, and there's a combined FIAS and FAIS. That's the Passive House Alliance US website, and so you can find out about membership and resources and other events that are happening around. And one thing I would like to point out is that we're proposing a standard which is different from the Passive House Institute, but there's no kind of like choosing sides going on here. In the FAIS chapters, we're interested in anybody coming, regardless if you want to certify or use the metrics of PHI or you like what FIAS is doing. It isn't about you know, oh, ours is the one you should use. It's about you know, how we do this as a, you know, how we make good buildings. So let's